So now that we've defined confined space, let's take a look at what a permit-required confined space is. Now in this case, what we've done is that we've taken a confined space and added one more characteristic, which would be a serious safety hazard. So if I have now 4 characteristics, the 3 we just mentioned that define a confined space plus a serious safety hazard, now we have a permit-required confined space, and now we have a space that falls under the permit-required confined space standard. Oftentimes the question comes up, what constitutes a serious safety hazard as opposed to simply a safety hazard? Well, the distinction is important with respect to the confined space standard. A serious safety hazard is defined as a hazard that prevents self-rescue. An individual exposed to the hazard can't get away from it for whatever reason. Exposure to live electrical circuits would be a good example. Hazardous atmosphere, these kinds of things. You can see other examples listed on the slide. Engulfment, surrounding and capture by a liquid or a finely divided flowable substance like coal or flour or sawdust, grain, something like this. Entrapment, sometimes spaces have taper down to a narrow section, to a narrow cone, and if somebody gets wedged inside that, they're not going to be able to get out. So if the hazard is such that the individual cannot escape that hazard and get out of the space, it's going to be considered a serious safety hazard under the standard. Things like asbestos probably wouldn't trip this requirement, because if you're exposed to asbestos, you still have the ability to self-rescue, to move away from the hazard. Now, we're not arguing for exposing people to asbestos. If there's asbestos, then you have to comply with the asbestos standards. But it wouldn't trigger the permit-required confined space standard if that was the hazard that you were concerned about. There are other confined spaces we might have to deal with. If you're working in the electrical power generation and transmission industries, the electric utilities, you might have heard the term enclosed spaces, typically vaults. Now these are confined spaces in a sense. However, they are often entered under normal operating conditions by qualified employees. That is, people who know how to work around live electrical circuits. And they'll be entered under the electrical power generation and transmission standard, the requirements there, under 1910-269. If we're doing welding, under the welding standard, 1910-252, they also define a confined space as a relatively small restricted space. The main issue here is that if we're welding, we're generating a lot of fumes, and we want to make sure those fumes don't accumulate in a tight little space and poison the person doing the welding. So if I have a relatively small restricted space and I'm doing welding in that space, I'll need to make sure that I'm complying with the ventilation and the rescue standards that are spelled out under the welding standard, 1910-252. Under construction, we also have confined spaces. Now these again are defined fairly broadly. They have a limited means of egress and subject to the accumulation of toxic or oxygen deficient atmospheres. In that case, under the construction standard, I am obligated to develop the procedures and policies and training and equip the people properly so that they can deal with those hazards appropriately. Beyond that, in the maritime standards, longshoring, grain handling, mining, all of these other standards also try to address the hazards of confined spaces. Each do it a little differently, and so if you're involved in those industries, go take a look at those standards. If you have any questions, feel free to give us a call. The next category of space we'd like to look at are non-permit required or reclassified spaces. We'll talk about them briefly here, but we'll deal with them in more detail down the road in a different session. If I have reclassified a space, now there's no need to have a permit program, entrance supervisor, entrance, attendance, rescue services, all these kinds of things. But we can only reclassify spaces under very specific conditions which are spelled out by OSHA. If it only has a hazardous atmosphere, we can reclassify using one procedure, which we would call C5, named after the paragraph of the section in the standard. If we can eliminate the hazards, there's no possibility of a hazardous atmosphere, we can reclassify under paragraph C7. So in this program, we took a few minutes to define a confined space, and then we saw a permit-required confined space, a confined space with a serious safety hazard, a hazard that prevents self-rescue. And then finally, we briefly looked at non-permit or reclassified confined spaces. In future sessions, we'll be talking more about these issues. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.